Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clauser, with the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about Washington State again and again, repeating this account that it uses to fund low interest loans to cities to build vital public infrastructure. But instead, the state is taking this money and filling its operating deficits. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about this account and how long this has actually been going on for?
Yeah, so the Public Works Assistance Account is this account that was created in 1985, and it provides funding for a low interest revolving loans. That means that the loan interest payments go back into the account, and it allows local governments like cities, counties, special purpose districts to uh, get financing for projects at a lower interest rate than what the private market would provide, and they can build roads, bridges, they could build sewer and water facilities that, among other things, is critical for being able to build housing that everybody keeps talking about. Well, really starting in the 2000s, the state legislature started using this account and all the money sitting there to plug holes in the operating budget. And it kind of ramped up in the 2010s, but this last biennium and with this new budget, it really is taking off. So between 1985 and 2017, $2.2 billion were diverted from this account. In this biennium alone, the 2025-27, it's going to be over $800 million. So that's just one biennium. And that's from an account that would be going to pay for other types of projects. And it's instead going to the general fund. And so there's I think the biggest thing really is how they've drained this account to where that has no more money. But on top of that, they're taking money that was allocated to projects that have been already approved for funding. So these are projects that the Public Works Board said, you know what, we're going to fund you. Here, you're authorized to get the funding. And the state legislature said, actually, no, we're going to take that money. And the way they're getting away with it is they are issuing bonding authority so that the Public Works Assistance Account will continue to get the money to the tune of, $389 million for this biennium. So in other words, they're taking out, they're issuing bond debt to fund projects for a loan program that has a lower interest rate, right? It's like taking out a loan at 6% to pay off a loan that's at a 3% interest.
What's the risk here? Say the state it's pulling this money. I mean, it's one of many one-time transfers. They also pulled $880 million from the state's rainy day fund, about half of it to plug the deficit this year. What's the risk with this Public Works Board account if the state can't repay this money on time? What happens to those projects? I mean, we're talking about roads and bridges, the types of infrastructure that we drive across every day. Not like these clean energy projects or other things that aren't as important for say today day-to-day life.
Well, I think they're going to get the money from the bond uh uh debt. They're going to get that money. I don't think that that's the issue really. The issue is that they are effectively taking out debt to pay for operating budget expenditures. And for people who are familiar with our state, or if you're not familiar, Washington state does not allow the legislature to take out debt for its operating budget. It has to be a balanced budget, and it has to be balanced according to the forecasts that are done by the State Economic and Revenue Forecast Council. This really sets a dangerous precedent where the legislature can take out bond debt, which they're allowed to do for capital projects. Then what you could do is you could take a bunch of money from an account like this one, and then you just simply take out bond debt, which you can do because it's a capital um, budget account. And then you just put that money in. So it's where you can go into different accounts, take the money out of it, and use that to spend on the general fund. And then you take out bonding debt to put that money back into the account. And we've seen these kind of fiscal tricks and gimmicks. The same thing with the budget stabilization account. Under state law, you can't withdraw money from the account unless there's been a declared emergency. There's the revenue forecast is below a certain amount, or the legislature gives a two-thirds approval. What the legislature realized is if they divert the money before it ever gets into the account, they don't need to get that two-thirds majority or the declared emergency or the revenue stuff. So over the last couple of years, one of the ways that they've propped up this massive increase in state spending is by diverting money from the rainy day fund before it even gets there, which doesn't require a supermajority or a two-thirds majority in order to achieve. So that's what another thing that we could see here. And this is a fiscal trick that could be definitely used if there's a drop in revenue and if they don't get the tax revenue that they're expecting. So and it's really not being it's not getting the attention that I feel like it deserves because that this is effectively there it's another example of how they're able to bypass state law on budgeting policies.
And you think of, bonding a capital project. Say you have this piece of infrastructure, a bridge, for example. You know it's gonna last at least 20 years, benefiting 20 years of taxpayers. So you might be willing to extend the payment. Say, "We'll pay off that total project over the course of 20 years with this bond." But now they're doing this with the operating budget. So you're essentially telling me that taxpayers are for this year's budget, say an employee's salary in the operating budget, that's being bonded out. So taxpayers for years to come will be paying off an employee's salary for this year.
Well, what they are gonna have to do is they're gonna have to pay the bond debt, and it's remained pretty stable. It's around 2.4 billion dollars annually. It shifts and fluctuates, but it's pretty much 2 something billion dollars a year. But I s what I mean, it's a question of how desperate are state lawmakers gonna get when it comes to this complete unwillingness to cut spending on a collective or general level. And on top of that, you have a recession or a drop in revenue where they already have a budget deficit and they have at a time of record revenue level. What happens when they have a recession at the same time? And they've got a $20 billion deficit. This is I mean, $20 billion, I believe, is how much they owe. 24 billion is the bond debt that we have. But again, are state and lawmakers willing to do that to maintain the spending? And every time people think that they're going to have to cut spending, they just raise taxes. And so at some point, this is a way to get around that because you don't have to raise taxes. You just take out debt. And if you do it in this way, because this went completely under the radar, $389 million in debt being taken out that indirectly plugs an operating budget gap, right? But it went completely under the radar. I don't think anybody else has picked up on it or put the pieces together. So that's one way they could get around this is just by taking out a bunch of bonding authority to deal with this, and nobody really notices because it's not a direct tax.
Isn't bonding authority limited though? I mean, how far can they go with this? I mean, they're draining this account now and bonding it back. I mean, you mentioned we could be in a drastic situation if we reach a recession. What happens if both of these accounts, the operating account and this public works account, are both facing shortfalls?
I mean, that's where it's gonna get a little frightening for the local governments that need stuff to be funded, that need water and sewer, and it's gonna delay or indefinitely, potentially, housing development in areas where they can't get water and sewer, infrastructure there, because if you don't get it, you're not allowed to build. And they keep talking about why, talk about housing unaffordability. Well, you can't increase the supply in areas where there's not sufficient infrastructure. And this is what this account was intended to fund were projects like these.
So I know you talked to AWC, the Association of Washington Cities, and you also talked to the Association of Washington Counties. Two major stakeholders. They represent pretty much every city, municipality, county across the state. What did they have to say about this?
I mean, it's a more of there's more of a bone for AWC because they're cities and they in special purpose districts get most of the money, most of the projects funded. And it's difficult for them because they need to have some certainty when they're applying for these project funding and to have funding from pre-approved, already approved projects taken away. And yeah, they're putting uh, money into that, but that's not even half of the amount of money that they've taken out of this account. And so it really is going to, and I think the other thing that's worth noting is this account is partially funded by the real estate excise tax revenue that cities and local governments get. So they divert some of that money that they get to this account that is supposed to be for them. And then when they go to get the money to pay for projects, it's instead being taken and thrown into the general fund. I mean, there's one instance where a chunk of money is being taken from the Public Works Assistance account, and it's going to the Climate Commitment Act because they're withdrawing money from the Climate Commitment Act to go towards the working families tax credit. I mean, this is the kind of shifting and shell game that's going on
Mhm.
fiscally where money is being taken from one account to fund something else. And so this goes back to what I was saying about the bonding authority is they're using debt to indirectly prop up the state operating budget. And so, where you like you were saying, where does that end? And also, what laws are lawmakers willing to change in order to expand that? Because they've done that with the Puget Sound Gateway project, where I think that they were bonding. They authorized bonding authority for toll revenue. They made some policy change where they're basically, you know, gambling, one could argue, on future toll revenue. So that's where they could if there's a law that's in their way, they can just go change it. Or they can get around that law the same way they're getting around the balance apparently getting around the balanced budget requirement. So it's hard for for people to say, well, how do they do this? Well, I I apparently am not that creative or imaginative about how to get around and circumvent the law, but this is one of the ways that they've managed to do it. And whether that was the intention, that's a separate issue. But it is a fact that is something that they did. And this is in effect what it's done. And it sets a precedent for how they might respond to future fiscal crises in the state.
Mhm, and with this most recent deficit, it was about the governor put it at about $2 billion for the 2026 session. They filled much of it, with this transfer, the rainy day account,
Yeah.
like I mentioned, and these were framed as temporary measures to, help us, hurdle the challenges in front of us today, but as you've said, as you've uncovered, this has been going on with the public works account for years. I mean, at what point does it go from being temporary to a structural measure for the budget?
I mean, that's I the thing is that as one, person I interviewed said, "This account has been underfunded more times than it's been fully funded." So, in effect, it's an account that exists for the state. It acts as almost a de facto, crypto rainy day fund 2.0. It's a separate rainy day fund that they don't that they can use for other purposes. They can it's it used to be called the Public Works Trust account, but the money's not protected in any way. So they can use it for general fund purposes. They can use it for the loan that it's supposed to pay for, or they could use it for something else. And so it's that's how it's being used right now. And so the question is, like you said, when is it finally going to actually be put towards the purpose it was created for? And there doesn't seem to be any indication in the near future that that's going to be the case.
Mm. I'd be really interested to see how major players like Seattle, Bellevue, and Spokane, how much money they're putting into this account and how much they're getting out in
That is a
return.
very good question.
Um, yeah, TJ, appreciate you covering the story. And for anyone hoping to read that article, you can get it at thecentersquare.com. But otherwise, TJ, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus. Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clauser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about a prominent state Democrat joining the fight against the new state income tax that could hit high earners in the next few years. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about who's joining the fight, a little bit about their history, and why this really matters?
Yeah, so the person who's joining in this legal effort is Phil Talmadge. He is a prominent Democrat who is a former Washington State Supreme Court justice, but he was also a state senator and he was a chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So he's also I've never heard this term before because I'm not in the legal world, but he's been selected as a super lawyer in Washington State numerous times, and this is, and so it just goes to show the pedigree that he has legally coming into this legal fight. So that's it's really interesting because the legal team also has former State Attorney General Rob McKenna. So you have a former state attorney general and a former state Supreme Court justice in this legal fight against the income tax. So we're we're really seeing like this is kind of like the 1920 for people who love baseball, the 1927 Yankees or Murderers Row or you know, you're seeing the top game legally coming to fight this income tax.
We're seeing players from both sides of the aisle. McKenna was a
Right.
Republican, Talmadge a Democrat. I mean, a super attorney. It seems like we're gearing up for what could be a super suit.
Mhm.
I believe in your article you mentioned that Talmadge he has weighed in on an income tax in the past. We know this has been on the ballot. I want to say 10 times over the last 100 years
Yeah.
in Washington State. Most recently, around 2010 or so. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how he ruled at the time?
I mean, so as going as far back as 1933, and I was actually kind of surprised. Talmadge did a analysis of a initiative 1098 from 2010 that would have created a graduated income tax, and it was. I think it's worth bearing in mind how overwhelmingly that in 2010 that initiative was rejected by voters. It was rejected in almost every single precinct in the entire state. There was maybe a handful of precincts in Seattle, like the bluest of the blue accepted voted in favor of this. Everyone else voted against it. So he actually went back as far as 1930. There was a case called Aberdeen Savings and Loan Association v. Chase that is declaring income to be property, and that's going to be the key point or contention that's going to be in this case. So yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that ruling? Because people hear, "Oh, the income tax is unconstitutional. It's written black and white in the Constitution," but it wasn't in the Constitution in its original form. It came about in 1930, and now this is really the law of the land and what Democrats are hoping the precedent that they hope to overturn should this hit the Supreme Court later this year or next year. Why don't you tell us about that ruling?
So this is going to be probably one of the most important Supreme Court rulings when if this lawsuit is launched, which is undoubtedly is going to be, because what it's going to get at is the question of whether income is property, and it is almost impossible to argue that it's not for various reasons because what they did in the 30s is they wanted to shift the property tax burden away from land and onto other forms of property, but they wanted to tax them at different rates because a property tax is going to be is going to have a different rate than an income tax. So they passed a constitutional amendment. It's the 14th Amendment to the Washington State Constitution, very different from the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. And it said that all forms of property are to be taxed at a uniform rate depending on their class. And they define properties, all things tangible and intangible, subject to ownership. So the only way that and what this does, it's important to note, is it makes an income tax by itself, it's constitutional. That's why they passed the voters pamphlet from 1933 or 1930 literally says the argument in favor of the amendment says we want this and we need this so that we can tax income at a different rate than land. And so what they would have to argue, the Supreme Court, in order to say that a progressive income tax is legal, is to say that income is not property. And I talked to a tax attorney probably 10 years ago about this, and he said if the state Supreme Court argued that income is not property under the definition in the 14th Amendment to our Constitution, then it cannot be stolen. Like, the legal implications of that are overwhelming, and I'd be interested in hearing what the arguments are gonna be made in front of the Supreme Court, particularly about Talmadge, because he used to sit on it, but that's gonna have to be their question is income property? Do you own your income? And I'm the legal argument to say that you don't, and I'm sure that somebody's gonna try and say that we're not taxing your money, we're taxing the transfer of money, which they call, they did it with the capital gains excise tax or income tax, which they
Mhm.
call an excise tax, but it's an income tax. And that's how they got around not having to address the issue of whether income is property. With this bill, with this law, they can't get around that. The Supreme Court will have to address the question of whether or not income is property. So having Rob McKenna, having Phil Talmadge on this legal team, you're going to have people who are as well versed in the constitutional history, not to mention the fact that the Supreme Court of the state has unanimously, consistently over the last 80, 90 years said that income is property. So this Supreme Court's going to have to explain why 90 years of legal precedent was wrong. So that is the stakes that are at play here with this lawsuit, this impending lawsuit.
Yeah, and we're talking 90 to 100 years, coming up on 100 years of this legal precedent, deeply rooted in our state's history and constitution at this point. But at the same time, Washington, until this income tax takes effect in the coming years, it's one of, I believe, around 8 or 10 states across the country that does not have an income tax yet. Many of the states that do have an income tax do not treat income as property. I mean, how could that impact this fight? I know Washington state is different than those, but since other states don't consider income as property, could that play a role in the Supreme Court's decision when they take up this case?
The problem is that our Constitution has the broadest definition of property, and this was acknowledged in the original 1933 uh, uh, decision that overturned a progressive income tax that was passed by the state. They just said we have the broadest definition of property you could possibly imagine. There is no way that income cannot fall underneath this definition. And if and I think that that's a problem is that they got to get around the Constitution. They can't cite other states' legal precedents because it's not applicable because they don't have our Constitution. They don't have our definition of property,
Mhm,
and they also don't have the uniform clause when it comes to property uh, classes. So, our property taxes have to be the same no matter where you are in the state as far as rates are concerned. That may not be the case in other states, but they're not ruling on other what they unlike our fuel efficiency standards of that advanced clean trucks and advanced clean cars policies. We can't adopt policies from other states and say that that applies to us. The state Supreme Court has to look at the Washington state constitution and say, okay, either income is property underneath this definition or it's not. And if it's not, we have to explain why. And they have to say
mhm,
subject to and yeah, it doesn't say explicitly that you own your income, but then the question is who does own your income? And if
mhm,
nobody owns it, then nobody can steal it. I mean, that's that would mean that somebody could go steal the income of the state Supreme Court justices, and it wouldn't be considered theft because it's not property. I mean, can you imagine the legal fight that would ensue if somebody stole their money and said it's income and it's not property? Like that, and that would raise other questions of what's the difference between wealth and income in that sense. So,
mhm,
yeah, and I'm sure that some people will say, well, here's the legal difference. There's wealth, that's what you own, income, what you earn, wealth is what you already have. I get that, but this just raises this would open up uh the legal discussion I think they would also have to explain why the other Supreme Court just prior Supreme Courts were wrong. I think they got 90
mhm,
years of saying, yeah, they said this for 100 years and here's why we think they're wrong. Here's something we discovered that's new and changes everything in that regard. This is where it's going to be very fascinating to have a former state Supreme Court justice on not on the bench, but sitting in front of them and probably knowing I would dare to say probably knowing as much, if not more, than they probably know on this topic because he's written about it so
mhm,
extensively and it's obviously he's getting involved because he wants to be involved in this legal fight. And so that's going to be a very different, I'd say, oral argument if he's going to participate in that.
mhm. This is definitely a very pivotal moment in state history and in our state's tax structure. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here. We're talking about this legal challenge that's building up, potentially to hit the Supreme Court to challenge the constitutionality of the income tax. But at the same time, we have efforts trying to get it on the ballot. I mean, the Democrats wrote in this clause that makes it quote unquote referendum proof, so voters can't take it to the ballot to potentially reject it before it takes effect. And it is supposed to take effect in 2028, with first payments being in 2029. But a lot of moving parts here. The Supreme Court could weigh in as soon as the end of this month on potentially whether or not we could see this hit a referendum. That would require about 145 or 150,000 signatures before June 10th for that to go on a future ballot. But even at that point, if voters approve it and it stays in place or rejects it, the Supreme Court could then come in later and rule on this case that Talmadge is joining with McKenna and others to challenge the constitutionality. So, I mean, even if voters do approve it in that off chance, I mean, we saw overwhelming opposition when there was hearings in the state legislature. So we'll see how that turns out if it does land on the ballot. But if the Supreme Court rules against it, we could have another situation where, say, when the income tax first came on the ballot, prior to 1930, voters actually passed it before the state Supreme Court came in and said, no, this isn't going to work. And they overturn that. But definitely interesting to see how this will all play out in the coming months and years. I mean, TJ, how long do we expect this lawsuit challenging the constitutionality? How long do we expect this to take before we see a Supreme Court decision? Could it be months or are we talking
I mean,
years?
that's gonna be the question is how long this fight's gonna play out and how long they're gonna wanna kick the can down. I think the biggest question is who's gonna wanna drag this out longer than the other. Because once there's a ruling, you know, that all bets are off as far as either way. But I'd say that I think it's interesting that the legislature decided to have the tax take effect as far as collecting the revenue for several years. And so that would indicate one could argue that indicates that they aren't as confident in it being upheld as they would otherwise think. Because if they
Well,
knew for sure it was going to be upheld, one could argue that they would have just said, you know what, let's immediately start collecting the tax. It's going to get
mhm.
upheld, no worries. Either that, or they're trying to figure out what the effect is going to be on people. I've written stories and others with our news organization on how people with wealth and income are leaving the state. And I don't mean in a literal sense. What they're doing is they're shifting their state residency to other states that have no income tax and don't have a wealth tax or an estate tax. And so, they'll stay in the state for 5 months. Then 6 months later, when it's about to be 6 months, they'll go somewhere else and live there for the rest of the year. And the state's not going to get the revenue it wants. And so the question is, how long does the tax on millionaires remain a tax only on millionaires?
Mhm, and we know that Democrats, repeatedly throughout the legislative session, were hesitant, did not say whether or not they would lower that threshold in future legislatures, saying they didn't want to construe, those legislatures. But TJ, thank you for diving into this. This will definitely be something that we put a lot of focus on in the coming months and years. And for those hoping to read TJ's stories, you can catch it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.
Citizen Action Defense Fund and Executive Director Jackson Maynard today filed a legal challenge to the income tax. And again, it was in Klickitat County Superior Court where this has been filed. That's in Southeast Washington in Goldendale. And two of the plaintiffs in the case reside there in Klickitat County. And the challengers can potentially find a more favorable court outcome than on this side of the mountains. That may have played into some of the decision on which court venue to file in. I know that was one of the considerations. So we're going to break that down for you now. So at the core of the lawsuit filed today is whether income is considered property, which some Democrats argue it is not. Rob McKenna, former state attorney general, says the Constitution is clear here in the state of Washington, and that people have a property right to their income. So, my income, my bank account, just like my home, my car in the driveway, is my property. It is mine. And the Washington Constitution says we could institute an income tax, but it would have to be uniform and it would have to be by our current state constitution limited to 1%, unless you amend again the state constitution to make it differently. So that's what's different this time around is there's no attempt by those who've backed Senate Bill 6374 6346 for the income tax, the tax on millionaires, There is no attempt to amend the state constitution to do it. It's just basically pass it. Might be unconstitutional, but it's going to be the courts that ultimately decide. And that's kind of been the route. So, Governor Bob Ferguson has said he believes that the court is going to rule in their favor and that this is the time to push this. Given the current makeup of the court, that might be the case. But remember, we have five positions on the current state Supreme Court that could be changing sides. Maybe you're going to have a more conservative court or at least a couple of more members of the court by the time this legal challenge reaches the state Supreme Court. So that is certainly something to consider in all of this. Now, we, on the last couple of days of session, had an opportunity to be in the governor's conference room as he signed this bill, 6346, for the income tax and some of the other last minute bills to be signed into law. And one of the reporters who gathered with him after kind of pressed him on this and said, what do you think about all the legal challenges coming to the income tax?
They'll have their day in court. And that's as it should be. They'll have their day before the people. Totally appropriate. I'm very supportive of the initiative process, and I think the people should weigh in on this. The Supreme Court should weigh in on this. So I've got zero issue on that, and I feel confident going forward.
Now, in this morning's press conference, where reporters we were given an opportunity to ask some questions, I had a chance to ask former Attorney General Rob McKenna about Governor Ferguson's recent comments because Governor Ferguson told a local television station that I've been on the opposite side with McKenna many times when I was AG and never lost a case when McKenna was litigating the other side. So I asked Rob McKenna about that somewhat personal uh, attack, I guess, if you will, from Governor Ferguson in this morning's press conference. And this is what he said.
I think it's very telling that Bob wants to personalize this and doesn't want to address the legal issues involved here. He was Attorney General. He's a lawyer. He understands what it means to have plain language in the Constitution and to have a series of Supreme Court decisions. This is not a boxing match. This is an important question of law, but he doesn't want to talk about the law. Instead, he signed into law a bill that clearly violates the law today, which is why he and the legislators who voted for it need the Supreme Court to change the law for them. And as of the day they voted for it, it was illegal. It violated the Constitution. And unlike former governors like Dan Evans, who had the courage and political skill to put together a coalition to put this to the voters as a constitutional amendment, Governor Ferguson was unable to do that. And the legislature was unable to come up with the votes to send a constitutional amendment to the voters either. Instead, Governor Ferguson and the legislature are working hard to keep this issue away from the voters. And all voters ought to be very concerned about that.
Now, former Democrat state senator and former state Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge has joined the fight alongside former AG McKenna and Citizen Action Defense Fund. Now, specifically, Talmadge is representing his client in this, one of the plaintiffs, which is the Ethnic Chamber of Commerce, and a number of small business operators that fall under that umbrella who are very concerned that they're going to be hit hard by this income tax. And so I spoke with Talmadge after today's press conference.
The communities we're talking about are people that are largely small businesses that are aspirational. They want to grow. They want to expand their businesses, and they want to generate significant income. So they do that. And what's the response from the state? Well, we're going to not only tax you in your business capacity, but we're going to tax you on your income. And they're concerned about that. I mean, it's a problem for them, and it's something that is a deterrent for them to do greater achievement than they've already done and have proven over the years. Hispanic folks and people from the Asian Pacific community both have been remarkable in their efforts to take a piece of the American dream and run with it.
Now, Democrats, of course, say that this tax is needed to address a regressive, what they call a regressive tax system in the state of Washington, where they contend that the richest are not paying their fair share. Critics say not only is it against the state constitution, but that it will open the door to a tax on the income of all Washingtonians. And now remember, we also have Let's Go Washington and founder Brian Haywood asking the state Supreme Court to let them run a referendum campaign. We talked about this last week. Secretary of State Steve Hobbs refused to process Haywood's referendum request, telling the Center Square that, since the bill was written to be sort of referendum proof, it's deemed necessary for the budget. You can't let voters weigh in. So he just kind of summarily dismissed it. The Secretary of State did. So Haywood has gone back to the state Supreme Court and said, wait a minute, he was completely out of line here in dismissing an opportunity for the voters to weigh in. And Haywood's sense is that the interpretation of the Secretary of State on what our Constitution says to make something referendum proof is wrong. It should be an emergency and necessary to implement the budget, not one or the other. And that's the contention of Haywood in his challenge to the state Supreme Court. And then, of course, also coming from Let's Go Washington, likely a couple of initiative campaigns, likely one that goes directly to the legislature and one that goes directly to the people, bypassing the legislature. Those initiatives require far more signatures than a referendum would. A referendum would only require a couple 100,000 signatures. You might need twice that or close to twice that, assuming you've got, some invalidation rate for folks that sign to get an initiative qualified to the ballot. But both of those paths are likely and likely this year. So things are moving still rapidly. Multiple lawsuits, a challenge request to the secretary or to the state Supreme Court from the Secretary of State's refusal to process the referendum, and then the initiatives to come. So much to follow on this, and it is changing literally several times a day.